This game is a real pleasure to play over. Larry Evans, in his introduction to this game, in Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, said that Fischer plays like Paul Morphy in this game. Now, one of the interesting things about Fischer, when you compare him to Garry Kasparov or Magnus Carlsen, who are usually also seen as sort of the two of the three greatest players of all time, is that Fischer's play is much clearer than Magnus or Kasparov. So their games are really hard to follow sometimes. They're so advanced. But when you watch Fischer, everything is so clear and makes perfect sense. And this game is a good example of that. It was played in 1962 at the Olympiad. His opponent is Karl Robach, and Fischer has white, and Robach has black. Let us jump right in. Fischer begins with e4. Black plays d5. The center counter, or Scandinavian, that would have been more of a surprise then probably than it would be today. It's more common today than it was at that time. E d5, queen d5. And the reason it wasn't so common then is because of this move, knight to c3. Fischer is able to develop a piece, a minor piece with tempo against black's queen. That queen has to move. There are three squares that queen could go to. It could go to a5. d6 has been played quite a bit. But Robach chooses the move queen to d8, which seems odd at first. The idea is basically black wants to create a c6, e6, Caro-Kann-like pawn structure, but avoid all of that Caro-Kann theory, avoid the advanced variation, all of that stuff. And he knows his queen is going to end up on c7, b6, probably anyway, one of those two squares. So it doesn't matter whether he goes queen to d8, c7, or queen to a5, c7. He's just playing a solid game, and this is playable. d4 from white, but then g6. Now he's starting to get really exotic. Another move without a piece being developed. The idea is he wants to play bishop to g7 to target this d4 pawn. And this d4 pawn is a little vulnerable because the knight gets in the way of c2. If he could just play c2, c3, then the pawn would be fine, but it can be a target. So that's what Robach is doing, but he's not paying attention to his development. Bishop to f4 from Bobby Fischer, and here is his simple plan. He wants to play queen to d2, bishop to h6, exchange off the dark squared bishops, then play h4, h5, open up the h-file, and attack his opponent's king. Those of you that are familiar with Fischer's games will recognize this is the same strategy he uses against the Sicilian dragon so many times. The same basic thing. He's just doing the same thing as he does against the dragon. Bishop to g7, queen to d2, and this pawn on d4 is hanging, but it's too dangerous to take. If black takes with the queen, then queen takes d4, bishop d4, knight to d5, and he's attacking the c7 pawn, threatening to take it with check and win the rook. There would be a fork there. After king to d8, trying to defend, then just long castle. The rook is opposite the king, and black is finished here. And if he takes with the bishop, then just long castle. Now there's a pin on this bishop against the queen, the rook and queen. Pin it, and if he plays c5 to defend, then now just knight to b5. Still with the threat of knight to c7 check and, threatening to take the bishop. That would be it. So it's too dangerous to take that d-pawn right now. So black plays knight to f6. And long castle from Fischer, again, just following his normal clear plan of exchanging off the bishops and playing h4, h5. Simple. c6 is played by black. The idea is he wants to play the bishop to e6 so it can be in a position to attack white's king on the queen side, but he has to control the d5 square first, so he plays c6 to control that d5 square. And now Fischer offers the exchange of dark squared bishops. The best move for black here was actually to go ahead and take that bishop, and after queen takes h6, now play bishop to e6, and he can play queen to a5 later, and maybe generate some pressure on the queen side. White is still better, but that probably would have been his best path. But by castling short, now Fischer has his target, and he proceeds to attack with vigor. h4, just as we mentioned, the idea is to play h5, exchange off on g6, and open up the h-file for this rook at h1 to gain power, where the queen can join in the action. Queen to a5 from black. Now, he is putting some pressure on white's queen side, not too much. And he also might want to use this queen to defend on the king side, so it has some lateral access to the king side. Fischer just goes ahead with h5, not worried about it. Now, there are a few ways black can deal with this. Let's say, what if he takes with a knight? Fischer can just take with the bishop, and then after king takes, because he wants to leave the knight here to block the rook. If the knight moves, the queen can come in to h6 with check. Fischer could just play bishop to e2, piling up on that knight, also with threats of g4. Again, trying to move that knight so he can open up the h-file. Let's say knight to d7, then g4, and knight to h to f6. Queen can now come in with check. Again, it's backed up by the rook. And if the king moves, one line is just g5. And after knight to h5, obviously if it moves anywhere else, it would just be mate on h7. You could actually take it with a rook. After pawn takes bishop to d3, and the threat of mate on h7 is decisive. There's nothing black can do. He can play f5, but then just g6. And again, Fischer would be threatening mate on h7. After knight to f6, his rook would hang. After knight g8, g7 would be mate. That's a long line, but it's an example of the danger that black faces in this position. So Rovac instead goes ahead and takes with the pawn and leaves the knight on f6. But again, this diagonal is now open, just as we saw in that last variation. So Fischer plays bishop to d3, aiming at the h7 pawn. Simple moves, simple development. And his opponent is a grandmaster, but he's still playing simple chess. Knight b to d7, knight g to e2. This knight could go to g3 at some point, maybe enter into f5 or h5. Rook to d8, placing the rook opposite white's queen, although obviously there's a lot in between at the moment. And Fischer just plays g4. At this point, he's not worried about material, right? He just wants to open up lines against the king. If black, for example, if black were to take, he could just play rook d to g1, and there's far too much pressure here. There's no way black could possibly survive an attack in this position, so he does not take that pawn. Instead, he plays knight to f8, adding a defender to the king side, but now Fischer just takes on h5. Very simple, opening up the g-file, ready to move that rook over and apply more pressure to the king. Knight to e6. He wants to defend g7 with that knight. The bishop at g7. Rook d to g1, applying the pressure. King to h8. Now Fischer takes on g7. Knight takes g7 is forced. And finally, queen to h6, threatening mate on g7. Just think about how simple Fischer's play has been. Just exchange off the dark squared bishop, h4, h5, open up lines, and he has a vicious attack against a really strong player. Rook to g8, pretty much required to defend g7. And then here, a very strong move from Fischer. Rook to g5, preparing the doubling of rooks, but doing so with a free tempo, by attacking the queen. Rovac has to move the queen, so Fischer gets a free move to double on the g-file. Queen goes back to d8. Rook h to g1. Now he's threatening to just capture twice on g7. Rook takes, queen takes, and that would just be checkmate. But here, black plays knight to f5, and that does cost him a piece. He was lost either way. Fischer just takes, and that is a free piece. If bishop takes f5, he could just play rook takes g8 check, and if the knight takes, it's queen g7 mate. If the queen takes, it's just too much material. This rook takes, and queen f4, and that would be far too much material, and Fischer, queen before a rook, and Fischer would easily win. So really a beautiful game, a beautiful attacking game, and I think those themes in the game are very clear, even for us mortal players. That's one thing about Fischer, clear brilliance. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.